Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Giannopoulos, and today I'm going to be talking about optical amplifiers. So firstly, starting us off with what is an optical amplifier. As it says on the screen, this is when an optical signal is amplified directly without us needing to convert the signal to an electrical one first. And so then the importance of this, firstly, and in my opinion, the least exciting one, is that it's more power efficient. Going from optical to electrical and then back again requires some amount of power, and that also generates heat. So by streamlining the process, you make it more power efficient, which is both environmentally better, resource-wise better, and overall saves you time and money. Then secondly, there's high data rates. I made note that this is different than what we think of as consumers in the context of our cell phones. On a grander scale, this allows for a large amount of information to be passed at the speed of light because it is an optical signal. So already optical signals themselves can hold a mass amount of information, and then moving at a speed of light just makes it a tremendous rate at which that this happens. So allowing it to remain in the optical realm rather than transforming between electrical and then back again doesn't have any of that slowing and stopping, stop and start, and keeps the whole process streamlined as well. Third, by keeping the signal intact. So this is referring to either the introduction of noise or some degradation of the signal if it were to be converted to electrical and then back again. I equate this to when you have an image, but you want to crop it and you only want a portion of it, but then you want to blow it back up again. The resolution that you have of this blown up image afterwards is not the same resolution that you had initially because there was a finite amount of pixels. And so leaving it in the optical realm keeps the signal from having any minimum amount of degradation or noise introduced in the process. Lastly, and this one I personally thought was the most important, optical amplifiers are wavelength independent at the current state that they are. In the past, what happened is that they had one laser that was the shining light that passed through optical amplifiers, but it was a white light laser. And so that is an amalgamation of all of the wavelengths of light that are out there. And so it didn't allow for any more than one to pass through because it needed all of those wavelengths in order to power and to have enough energy to pass through. Whereas now it's able to handle individual wavelengths because they each are able to get enough energy to be amplified. And for a certain range, it doesn't discriminate between one on the higher or lower threshold of its range. So it can pass even 80 up to like 80 or more signals at a time, which is incredible. And here are the big three optical amplifiers. In my opinion, there are smaller, lesser known ones as well. I will be focusing only on one for the majority of this presentation. So in the bottom, you have bottom two that I won't be getting too much into are the Raman amplifiers and the semiconductor optical amplifier. As the name suggests, the Raman amplifier relies on Raman scattering properties in order to amplify the signal. And then the semiconductor optical amplifier uses, as you guessed it, semiconductors, and it takes advantage of its electron hole recombination in order to amplify the signal. Whereas at the very top, you have what is known as doped fiber amplification, or DFA for short. The next slide is going to get into what the steps involve. But yes, focusing on this schematic of what happens, the signal initially comes in, some energy is pumped through this doped fiber, and then the signal comes out more amplified than it initially started with. So to get more into what that entails, so doped fiber amplifiers, they rely on heavy rare earth metals to excite optical signals. In this case, I'm going to talk about EDFA. The E stands for this element called erbium. And they use erbium because it is best suited for minimum loss for silica-based optical fibers, which is the dominant base material for most optical fibers out there. And so that's why it's the most attractive. And so the steps that go into how it works is that first you have to dope the optical fiber, which in this case it's with erbium ions. Next, you pump energy into these erbium ions to get them excited to higher energy states. In the case of erbium, well, in all the case of the DFAs, you excite the ions to a higher energy level than the energy of the optimal wavelength that'll go through the signal. In this case, erbium is best suited for 1550 range signals, which is what the best signals for the least amount of loss in silica are. And so that's why it's the most attractive as well. And so in the case of erbium, the two wavelengths of light that they most use in order to most excite it are 1440, and then I'd like to say 980. I'm just trying to confirm very quickly. Sorry. Yes, 980. Shouldn't have doubted myself. Then the excited erbium ion will cause stimulated emission to occur when the signal passes through. This is when a photon of the same energy, phase, and direction gets excited by the photons from the signal. And so since they are in phase, the two photons combine and thus add energy to the signal in the process, thus amplifying the intensity of the signal. And so the fifth step is that there's a chain reaction of stimulated emission that occurs for the signal to be amplified altogether. Since it's not just one ion every time, it's a bunch of ions that thus when the signal is outputted at the end, it has the same property but a greater intensity, and that intensity is dependent on either the dopant concentration themselves, the length of the amplifier, and also the signal itself to start with and how it ended if it encountered any loss along the way. Yeah, so then next is a brief history of optical amplifiers, and specifically with the doped fiber amplifiers. It all started with a man named Gordon Gould, who invented the laser in 1957. And with it, he also invented the principle of optical amplification. He actually went through a bit of issues with patent law, and so he wasn't able to patent that he was the inventor of the laser for a long time. He was able to patent the concept of optical amplification. So that was when optical amplification first came to the forefront. So we have him to thank that then people built on it. And so then later in the 1960s and the early 1970s were the first developments of low loss optical fibers. And then it's important to note when Gould co-founded his optical telecommunications equipment firm, Optelecom, in 1974, because some important inventions came out of those later that I mentioned. Then in 1986, you have two professors from the University of Southampton in the UK, and they're the first to propose this concept of using rare earth doped fibers for amplification. And then only a year later, these two were able to show that erbium, in the case of EDFA, successfully can amplify a signal by using erbium as a dopant. And thus you can amplify an optical signal directly without needing to convert it to electrical signal first. Then in the early 1990s, which was only a few years after the creation or shown success of EDFA, the technology started to take off. And so this showed that there was a significant development of long-haul optical communications, and it all started in the early 1990s. Then back to Optelecom very quickly, where they helped start this corporation called Sienna Corp by this one entrepreneur, but then more importantly, their former head of light optics research, David Huber, left them to go with this spin-off company that he heads. And then Huber comes back a few years later with another man from Sienna Corp, and they invent this thing called the dual stage optical amplifier. And so basically that was the initial catalyst for this wave division multiplexing that I briefly mentioned earlier, which allowed for more than just one optical signal to be amplified at a time. It allowed for, as the name suggests, the wavelengths to be divided up and each be given enough energy to then be amplified and passed down through the optical amplifiers without losing signal, and thus allowing for a broader range and a greater amount of optical signals to be transmitted at a time. And then since then, you have the other amplifiers, the Raman and the semiconductor base, which I mentioned earlier, as well as others. And then you have the dense wave division multiplexing, which allowed for even more optical signals to be transferred at a time. Then you have YDFA, which is very similar to EDFA that I've been talking about, but it's based on an element called ytterbium, which is, sorry, not as widely commercially manufactured as erbium. And it has a more specific applications than erbium, and thus isn't as widespread as used, but still important. And then you have other earth metals that are also successful with this doping of fiber amplification. However, as mentioned, they're even more specific and narrow of range than erbium or ytterbium, so they aren't as widely used. And so now into some environmental and geopolitical considerations. So erbium on the left and then ytterbium on the right both come from the same crystal called monazite. So monazite is a combination of a lot of different elements, and so it's very inefficient even though it's mined pretty heavily, because you get upwards of say 0.1% of erbium or ytterbium even when you kind of chemically are able to filter out these elements. So it's a resource intensive process, it's a time intensive process. And then geopolitically, predominantly erbium comes from China. Ytterbium has a greater amount of countries that produce it, but since it's not as widely commercially used than erbium, it's not as attractive. So then again, profitability that not as many people mine it overall, even though it is over a wider range of countries. So you have the considerations that it overall might be a net negative, that although you are making your telecommunication system more power efficient, in order to get to the point of having enough erbium and then the process of doping it into the optical fibers may require too much resources to make up with the efficiency. And geopolitically, it's hard to rely on other countries when relations are always changing. And then future considerations I was thinking was that the optical fiber amplifiers specifically that I've been focusing on, they require, as the name suggests, a wired transmission, whereas now it seems that the telecommunication system is leaning more towards wireless capabilities. So I think that it might hit a wall soon if they don't transfer over and consider how to make it more wireless oriented. But yeah, that's a little bit about optical amplifiers for you all.